With that said, though, it's time to get to the topic of the day. And boy, oh boy, oh boy, is this one a doozy. The topic of the day is this crazy, insane Jimbo Fisher, Texas A&M NIL story, where essentially Texas A&M signs the number one class. They're accused of cheating. Other SEC coaches are commenting. Jimbo Fisher is chirping. So let's get into it. Let's talk about it, and let's discuss. Obviously, I want to give a little bit of background, a little bit of context before we get into it. And the background is pretty straightforward, and it's something that has really been a topic on this show for the last, probably 4 to 6 weeks. That topic is Texas A&M just signed a historically great recruiting class. Coming out of the first national signing day, it was ranked number 1 in the country. A few days afterward, they added a couple extra players after signing day, and it became historically, according to the computers, the greatest recruiting class in the history of college football. Now, it's a little bit different this year because you can sign more players because of the transfer portal, but it was considered the best class of all time. And then on top of that, the second signing day was earlier this week, and on the second signing day, they even added another couple of marquee players, and it firmly established itself as the greatest recruiting class in the history of college football. Doesn't guarantee anything, doesn't mean multiple national championships, but on paper, it is the greatest recruiting class in the history of college football. But what we also know is that basically in the history of recruiting, football, basketball, maybe other sports as well, anytime any school does something that they have not historically done, oh, you know what happens next. The accusations, well, they have to be cheating. And I'm not saying that whatever. But the bottom line is we know how it is. If you're not Alabama or Ohio State in football, if you're not Kentucky or Duke in basketball, well, it has to be something fishy going on. And that is something that has happened really over about the last 2.5 months at Texas A&M. Dating back to the first signing day, there was this weird message board post, and many of you sent it to me, and I did not talk about it on this show. I don't deal with message board innuendo. Now, if somebody credible says something, I'll talk about it, right? If Dabo Swinney is rumored to leave Clemson, I'm not going to talk about it if it's on a message board. But if Bruce Feldman reports that Dabo Swinney is willing to listen to LSU, that's a little bit of a different deal. So I bring it up because about 6 or 8 weeks ago, when A&M's recruiting class first picked up steam, there was a post on a message board that there was a slush fund, that the reason that Texas A&M signed the number 1 recruiting class in the history of college football is because there was a slush fund with $30 million from Texas A&M boosters, basically guaranteeing $1 million per player. And I saw it. Many of you sent it to me. I mean, I must have had probably half of a dozen to a dozen people send it to me, asking if I was going to comment on it. I don't comment on message board innuendo, but here was the crazy part. After that message board post went live, then a website called Bro Bible, kind of fun, men's lifestyle blog, whatever, no issue with them, posted about it. And then from there, this is the crazy part, a lot of the national media picked up on it. Again, I didn't talk about it, but I saw credible columnists, radio hosts, whomever, talking about this story as if it was fact, as if it was established that Texas A&M had a $30 million slush fund set up to pay recruits. And so that continued to pick up steam. Then earlier this week, Lane Kiffin gets in on the mix, and Lane Kiffin basically says, I hope some of these schools have a luxury tax, basically insinuating that Texas A&M went above the salary cap. And then finally on Wednesday afternoon, Jimbo Fisher commented on the whole situation, and this is what Jimbo Fisher said. He said, there's no $30 million fund. There is no $5 million fund. There is no $10 million. This is garbage. It pisses me off. It comes from a site called Bro Bible by a guy named Slice Bread, and everybody runs with it. So it's written on the internet as gospel. How irresponsible is that? There's some very reputable writers in college football and sports that wrote it and have said it and done things that's unbelievable to me. When I first heard it, I laughed. Oh yeah, what a clown. To which I say, first of all, shout out to Sliced Bread. I didn't know that somebody named Sliced Bread was the one that broke this story. But what I would say is I am so on board with Jimbo Fisher about this. Now, I'm not naive enough to believe that not a single promise was made, not a single dollar was whatever. I'm not that dumb, and we will get into that in a minute. But what I would also say is the idea that this was taken as absolute gospel blew my mind. It has continued to blow my mind, and I'm glad that Jimbo Fisher spoke out on it. And now I want to transition to the next part of this conversation, which is this, and this is my opinion, and this is where I think I'm going to start to make you at least hopefully think about this in a slightly different way than maybe you have before. Because yes, maybe there is a $30 million slush fund. Maybe it'll get uncovered. Maybe it'll be the biggest controversy in the history of college sports. But let me also put the opposite perspective out there as well. Why is it so crazy to think that Texas A&M and Jimbo Fisher just signed the number one recruiting class in the country and in the history of college football? And I know that is going to make you say, well, but Alabama, Ohio State. Here's my question. Why is it so crazy to think that Texas A&M signed the greatest recruiting class in the history of college football? And when I explain why, I do think it'll hopefully make you think about this in a little bit of a different way. First off, Texas A&M has a lot to sell just on the surface, right? They have a lot to sell. They play in the toughest division of the toughest conference of college football. In the same way that 13 other schools sell the SEC, they can sell the SEC. On top of that, they play in a 100,000-seat stadium that we saw against Alabama is rocking. There's no better environment in college football at its peak. And also on top of that, they have every facility in America. So there's that obvious element of it. Playing the SEC, play in a 100,000-seat stadium, all the stuff that's normal. On top of that, I also think it's important to note that they have a very unique recruiting pitch as well. They've said, look, we're on the cusp. You can go to Alabama and you can be great, but they've already done it. You can go to Georgia, but they just won a national championship. You can go to Ohio State, but also you can come here. And you can come here and be the first to win a national championship, the first to leave a legacy, the first to beat Alabama, to go to they beat Alabama this year, but the first to win an SEC championship, the first to go to the playoff, the first to compete for a national championship. That's a pretty good recruiting pitch. On top of that, it's also worth noting they're probably in the most talent-rich area of the country, right around the Houston area. And I looked it up today just for fun. They signed, I think 16 or 15 top 100 players in this recruiting class. 9 of them are from Texas. So the baseline, and I saw this stat of if they had only signed players from Texas, they still would have had something like a top 15 to top 120 recruiting class. So there's all that surface level stuff that, I'm sorry, but you can see the scenario where they would sign a great recruiting class this year. But on top of that, there is extra context that I do think needs to be considered for this specific conversation, this specific year, with this specific program, Texas A&M. The first is this. Texas A&M is coming off the greatest season that they've had in 30 years. Not this past season in 2021, but the 2020 season before. And all of you listening follow recruiting. I know you do, because if you didn't care about recruiting, you wouldn't listen to a college sports show that's almost all college sports, okay? So I bring it up because if you follow recruiting, you know that the best recruiting classes generally happen after one thing. After a great season, it's not usually felt that year, it's felt the following cycle. And so what do I mean by that? Most of Georgia's class was signed before they won a national championship this year. So in theory, they're going to get a bump next year when Kirby Smart can sell all these juniors of, hey, come here, you can win a national championship, and you can do everything else. Michigan, we're going to talk about Jim Harbaugh in a second. But it was very interesting to see the fact that he got 4, 5, 6 commitments after they made the playoff in this 2021 class, and I suspect that in this 2022 class, late commitments, and I suspect that he will have his best recruiting class ever in the 2023 cycle. That's the facts. The facts are that you usually have your best recruiting classes after your best season. So in Texas A&M's case, they have a historic season in 2020. Never forget, they finished 9-1. They finished 5th in the college football playoff rankings. They were basically, a committee vote or two away from making the college football playoff. And so, yes, it's natural that they are going to have a recruiting bump after going 9-1. Because remember, on top of everything they already had to sell, now they said, look, we were this close to making the college football playoff. Come here and be the ones that put us over the top. Everybody recruits well after their best season ever. It's not directly after the season. It's not the month or two after. It's the following cycle. So Texas A&M has a great 2020 season. Naturally, the 2021-2022 recruiting class is where they are going to make their best efforts. The juniors that watch them almost make the playoff then become seniors and get to watch and want to be part of what they just saw, okay? And by the way, expect Georgia to have a great recruiting class next year. Expect Michigan to have its best recruiting class ever after their success of this year. On top of that, and I think this is important to note as well, you know what else Texas A&M had going for it in this specific cycle that absolutely helped this specific situation? Everyone around them was a mess. LSU fired its head coach. Florida fired its head coach. Oklahoma had its coach leave. So on top of the fact you're getting all these guys from Texas that are already good, here's what else you need to know. One of the highest rated players that signed at Texas A&M, defensive lineman, Gabriel Brownlow Dindy, number 16 player in the country, defensive lineman from Florida. You know where he was committed to right up until the middle of December? He was committed to Oklahoma. And then Lincoln Riley left, and he said, I don't want to go to L.A., so I'm going to go with the school that I chose over Oklahoma, Texas A&M. So Texas A&M got, I think Jimbo Fisher would even admit, got kind of lucky on that one. Had nothing to do with slush fund, this, that. Kid was committed to Oklahoma. Coaching change happens. They get him. Shamar Stewart, 5-star who committed on whatever it was, Wednesday. Chose Texas A&M. At one point was considering Florida. Well, guess what? Florida fired their coach. Also considering Miami. Well, guess what? Miami had a new head coach that Shamar Stewart had no relationship with until a month and a half ago. Probably helped Texas A&M in the recruiting process. Beyond that, Jacoby Matthews, 4-star, high 4-star safety from Louisiana, committed to Texas A&M. You know what happened there? Really liked LSU. And then a funny thing happened. Coach O got fired. And then he had to reevaluate, and he could go with the coaching staff that he's barely known for a month, or he could go with the coaching staff that he's known for a year and a half at Texas A&M. And so I do think the context matters, and I should mention, by the way, as well, it's not as though Jimbo Fisher is some schlub. He's won a national championship. He's put 1 million guys into the NFL. And so to me, why is it so crazy that a school coming off their most successful season in 30 years, the 2020 season, the class after is great. It's led by a great in-state crop of players. And it also came in a year where all these other weird coaching changes gave A&M stability. Like, it's not that inconceivable that this specific set of circumstances could set up the number one recruiting class in the country. But let's take it a step further. Let me ask you a simple question. Even if there is a slush fund, let's step away from, because I think this was, listen, let's step away from there's no slush fund at all. But let's take it a step further. What if there is a slush fund? Well, guess what? You know who else had a chance to set one up? Georgia and Alabama and Ohio State and Texas and USC and whoever. And I bring it up to just say this. The NIL has changed everything, okay? And we don't have to like it, and I don't have to like the idea of a kid getting paid $1 million, and I'm not accusing Texas A&M of doing it. But I'm just saying, if a slush fund is set up, if you're going to pay a recruit $1 million to come there and call it NIL, unfortunately, that's not really illegal under the current setup of NCAA rules. Now, I know there's some weird verbiage about pay for play and recruiting. At the end of the day, anyone could do exactly what Texas A&M did. And if this is true, and I don't believe it's true, Jimbo Fisher says it's not true. I know he's obviously incentivized to say that. But if something like this is in place, it's allowed under the rules. And we don't have to like it. I don't like it. To be clear, if this is true, and I'm not saying it's true, I don't like the idea of recruits getting $1 million before they've proven anything, because you know who I think that hurts? The players on the roster that deserve the money, that have actually done something for the university. When Quinn Ewers makes it $1 million at Ohio State, you know who that hurts? It hurts the players that are actually playing. And so I hope that it's not true, that there's just some slush fund with $1 million in it for each individual signing. But at the same time, it's not against the rules. Now, I do think NIL needs to be regulated. At some point, I'm going to do a separate show on how we can fix NIL so that it doesn't become what people are accusing Texas A&M of doing. But at the same time, it's not illegal, and we don't have to like it. But even if we don't like it, it is not against the rules. It's no different, by the way, than Caleb Williams playing for Lincoln Riley at Oklahoma, Lincoln Riley leaving, and Caleb Williams just going with Lincoln Riley to USC. That's the way the rules are set up. We don't have to like the rules, but there's nothing we could do. And with Texas A&M, if this is the case, It's not really against the rules anymore. And if this is what they're doing, you don't think that everybody else in college football is going to do something similar? It's no different than anything else that has ever at one point been a recruiting advantage. At one point, having a football facility was a recruiting advantage. Then you know what happened? Somebody figured out, hey, kids like these big, shiny, fancy facilities. And so guess what happened? Everybody built a football facility. And then from there, it was about paying high-profile assistant coaches, and we'll bring in this offense coordinator, we'll do that. And then it was whatever the next thing is. And I bring it up to say, if this is the case, you don't think Alabama's putting a plan together with its boosters to get something similar? You don't think if Georgia believes that this is true, they're not putting together something similar with their boosters? Now, it's on the NCAA to stop this from happening. But per the rules, it's not really illegal. And so to me, I have no problem with it because these are the rules that were put in place. So even if Jimbo Fisher did this, and even if Texas A&M did this, well, guess what? Who has been clamoring for college athletes to get paid forever? All of you. And by the way, I have no problem with it. I've said from the beginning, you can go back and listen to podcasts from 3 years ago where I said if we don't put some rules in place, it's going to become paying for the highest bidder, going to the highest bidder, players going to the highest bidder. I said that 3 years ago. I said that whatever it was when Gavin Newsom and LeBron James, they were the first ones to talk about NIL. First NIL rule was put on the books in California. I talked about it then. I said if we don't put any regulations in place, it is going to be the Wild Wild West. It is going to be pay for play. It is going to be going to the highest bidder. I don't like it, but that was always the reality, and this is what you guys and girls told me you wanted. I actually thought Jimbo Fisher brought up a great point the other day when he was talking about this. He said, how come we all celebrated the fact that Nick Saban talked about Bryce Young making $800K or making $1 million or whatever he made? How come we celebrated this happening and that happening, but now all of a sudden it's not true? But what if it was? And that's my whole point, too. I think listen, I'm not naive enough to think that absolutely nothing happened, that no promises were made, that not a single dollar went to a single one of these players. But at the same time, this is what y'all wanted. This is where it's going if we don't put in rules. And so to me, I give Jimbo Fisher credit. I happen to think that it's a scenario where you have a great program with every resource available to it that is coming off a historically great year with a national championship winning coach in an offseason where there was chaos at LSU, chaos at Miami, chaos at Florida, chaos at Oklahoma, that the new head coach was allowed to take it, that Texas A&M was able to take advantage of. So to me, I just think if you really break it down, it kind of makes sense. But even if you don't, this is the world that everybody wanted. This was the world where we said, let's pay our athletes, let's take care of them. Now maybe we need to revisit those rules, but even if we need to revisit those rules, those are the rules that are currently in place. And so like I said, I don't like the idea of a player who's never played it down making $1 million. I didn't like it, by the way, when it happened with Quinn Ewers a year ago, 8 months ago, whenever he enrolled at Ohio State. But this is the world that you guys and girls wanted to live in. Well, now we're here. And so again, maybe next episode, maybe sometime next week, maybe once we get past this stuff, I will tell you how I would regulate NIL in the transfer portal. I think there's 3 easy steps to make all of this a much simpler process. But right now, these are the rules in place. And if they stay this way, guess what? If Texas A&M had an advantage this year, Alabama's going to figure it out. And Georgia's going to figure it out. And USC is going to figure it out. And Oklahoma's going to figure it out. Just in the same way that every other recruiting advantage, everybody else catches up. And so to me, it will be fascinating to see what happens. But to me, I am going to defend Jimbo Fisher. Because I just don't understand why it's so crazy to think that this guy signed such a great recruiting class in 2020.